Hey guys, welcome to Life Groups. Tonight we are finishing our series called Understanding God. These last few weeks we've asked the questions, what makes God who he is? And why is he worthy of our worship? While God is mysterious and powerful, we do get to learn what he's like through his creation and his revelation to us. We've learned these past few lessons how God is similar to us and different from us, and how God is triune in nature. Tonight, we will conclude our series by talking about God's providence. God's providence means God is actively working all things according to his eternal will. From the seemingly insignificant things, like the grass growing, to the extraordinary things, like politics, God is actively working and directing all of those things according to his will. We will dive into this definition and look at what God's providence reveals about who God is and what that means for us. Let's start with getting into scripture and some discussion questions. You may have learned about this in history class, but during the late 17th century to the early 19th century, a belief called deism became popular. Deism believes that there is a God, but this God created the universe and let it run on its own, observing all that happens. Deists believe that God is impersonal and doesn't intervene in creation. Based on the doctrine of God's providence, I can confidently tell you that our God is personal and actively involved in all that is ongoing in creation. As we continue our discussion on God's providence, I hope it becomes clear that God is not how the deists think, but that he is personally and actively involved in creation, and why this is a good thing. So let's return to talking about God's providence. So God is actively working all things according to his eternal will. How does God actually do that? There are two categories we will examine today for how God actively works all things according to his eternal will. First, God is actively working all things according to his eternal will as he is sustaining all things. We know that God created all things, but he didn't just create it and walk away. Hebrews 1:3 tells us that Jesus upholds the universe by the word of his power. This tells us that God is actively sustaining the creation he made and the properties of his creation. If God were to cease to uphold creation, everything would cease to exist. There is not one independent atom in all of creation, or as R.C. Sproul says, there is not one maverick molecule. God is actively sustaining all those things and all these things in their properties. What are some ways that we see this? One example of this is his physical creation. God is actively upholding or sustaining all of physical creation. Take Psalms 104, verse 14, where it says, "You cause the grass to grow for the livestock and the plants for man to cultivate, that he may bring forth food from the earth." We can read this and pass over the fact that God is causing the grass to grow. We may learn in school about the scientific processes that explain plants' growth and miss that underlying those scientific explanations, which are true for how grass grows, it's also true that God, the creator and the sustainer of those processes, is also actively sustaining and allowing that grass to grow. So God's sustaining work is one part of his providence. A second aspect of God's providence that we're going to look at tonight is the way that God is actively directing all things to a specific end. God's rule isn't impersonal, ruling like some removed king who's ordering decrees and witnessing them playing out from afar. He isn't passively sustaining all things, but he is actively involved in his creation, working all things according to his eternal will. And he's working in the everyday events, like the grass growing, as well as the more momentous or extraordinary events, like politics. God is using and working through all those things with purpose and intent. For example, I could think about my parents' marriage. From them going to the same college, which led them to serve in the same ministry, which led them to join the same friend group, which led them to meet, there were countless everyday events that led to my parents meeting one another. There were thousands of small everyday occurrences that led to them even meeting each other. This is just one example of how God is actively working and directing both big and small things to a specific end. Now, we've talked about how God is actively sustaining and directing all things in accordance with his will. But what is God's will? What is this specific end that God is providing and directing all things towards? As we find all throughout Scripture, God is working for his glory, and as it says in Romans 8:28, our good. This is a pretty incredible promise. Now, while God is working all things for our good, we don't always get to know or see the purpose for why things happen. It can be challenging to believe that God is working all things for our good. This requires us to have faith, to believe Scripture, and trust that God really is working all things for our good, even though we may not see it or feel like it all the time. So what does God's providence, his sustaining and directing work, teach us about who God is? It teaches us that contrary to what deists believe, God is near, intimately involved in his creation. Our triune God is not impersonal. Instead, he is our sustainer. As individuals and as a universe, we do not run on our own energy. Rather, we are actively sustained by God. God's providence also teaches us that things don't just happen by fate or luck, but everything happens for a purpose. God is actively directing all things. Finally, as we just talked about, God's providence teaches us that we have a God who is working all things for our good. We have a God who is for us. Let's pause now for some more discussion on the kind of God we have and what that means for us. We've talked about God's providence and how God is actively sustaining and directing all things for his glory and our good. Now, how does this truth apply to our lives? What does this mean for us? One of the biggest application points is that God's providence reminds us that our God is worthy of our worship. He is worthy of our awe and marveling. He is sustaining all of creation, every second, all that is. And it's in him that we live and move and have our being. Why would we not worship him? Our second application point is that if God's purposes cannot be disrupted, why would we resist him? Scripture makes it clear that God's purposes will be accomplished. We read in Job chapter 42, verse 2, that says, Job says, I know that you, meaning God, can do all things, and that no purpose of yours can be thwarted. If God's purposes will be accomplished, it's foolish to resist or act contrary to his will. Like a crashing tidal wave, it will inevitably crash upon us all. Therefore, we should look to live in line with God's will for our lives, rather than walk in sin in ways that displease him. We should align ourselves with him and study his word and learn more about the kind of life that God wills for us to live and walk in that way than try to go in our own way. Now, beyond these two applications, my hope is that as we spend this time learning tonight and all throughout this series about who God is, that your love for God would grow. I pray that understanding who God is would grow each of your love for him and grow your desire for other people to know God. I pray this would prompt you to consider those around you who don't know God and his love. Consider the unique gifts we talked about tonight, the great promise that God is working all things for the good of those who love him, that God has purpose even in the little things. And consider that some of your friends don't have that same assurance or promise. What could it look like to share this with them or talk about this with them? I hope that our time of discussion would lead to more ideas on what it looks like to apply all that we've talked about and share that with others.